The sky above Bremen burned with sunlight and smoke. It was the summer of 1943, a season when the air itself seemed to tremble with the sound of war. At 20,000 feet, a formation of silver bombers crawled through thin white cloud, their 4 engines hammering in rhythm. The lead plane's nose art, a pin-up girl and the words "Lucky Lady," shimmered with frost. Each aircraft carried 10 men and 10 beating hearts, steady under oxygen masks and flak jackets. Below them, the German countryside was already echoing with sirens. Dozens of black dots rose from the fields, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing fast, hungry for the kill. From the cockpit of one Bf-109, a young Luftwaffe pilot smiled. The American bombers looked heavy, slow, and absurdly confident. Flying fortresses, they called them, as if any plane could truly be a fortress in the air. Moments later, he fired. Cannon shells tore into one bomber's wing, setting its engine ablaze. Yet, it stayed in formation. Then another hit, and still the silver giant held course, streaming fire but refusing to fall. That day, German pilots mocked the flying fortress until they saw what it could endure. In 1942, the war in Europe had entered its darkest and most decisive phase. The German Reich stood stretched across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Volga. Yet its skies were beginning to tremble with a new sound, the deep, steady hum of American bombers. The United States Army Air Forces had arrived in Britain only months earlier, still learning what daylight warfare truly meant. Their mission was bold and unprecedented, to destroy Germany's industrial heart from the air, in broad daylight with precision bombing. It was a promise rooted in American confidence, and a belief that technology could outfly fear itself. To make that belief real, they brought with them the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a machine unlike any the world had seen. With its distinctive shape, heavy armor, and 10 men aboard, it was more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of American engineering faith. Its designers believed that tight formations of B-17s, overlapping defensive guns in every direction, could fight their way to a target and back without the need for fighter escorts. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe watched with curiosity. German fighter aces, veterans of Poland, France, and Russia, dismissed the new bomber as a cumbersome brute. Too slow, too large, too arrogant to survive. They had reason to think so. The Luftwaffe was still a force of fearsome skill and reputation, its pilots masters of interception and ambush. In the early months of 1943, that confidence held firm. Whenever the 8th Air Force sent a small group of B-17s over occupied France or the Ruhr, they were met with brutal efficiency. Squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s would slice through the bomber formations, their 20mm cannon shells tearing aluminum apart. Some bombers exploded instantly, others spiraled into the clouds, trailing black smoke and fragments of men and machine. The numbers were grim. In the first months of sustained daylight raids, American losses sometimes exceeded 10% in a single mission. But the missions continued. Every new raid pushed deeper, every target further east, and every time, the Germans saw something strange. Even under catastrophic damage, many of the flying fortresses refused to fall. Wings shredded, tails nearly severed, engines silent. They still clawed for altitude and limped back across the North Sea. Some landed with entire crew compartments blown away, yet the pilots, frozen, bleeding, half-conscious, somehow brought them home. German ground crews recovering wrecks began to notice the pattern. Armor plating around critical systems, fuel tanks that sealed themselves after hits, redundant control cables routed through different parts of the fuselage. The flying fortress was built not just to fly, but to survive what should have been death. Meanwhile, on the ground in England, the men of the 8th Air Force lived through a different kind of endurance. Every morning, the airfields of East Anglia roared awake. Crews gathered for briefings, faces pale under fluorescent lights, listening as red lines on maps traced their fate. They ate hurried breakfasts, loaded their .50 caliber guns, and climbed into metal that might bring them home. Or not. Each mission was a gamble against physics and fire. Yet for many of these young Americans, the B-17 inspired a strange, unwavering trust. They called it their ship, their lady, their fortress. It was loud, brutal, and slow to climb. But when the sky erupted with steel, it felt like something alive was fighting to protect them. By mid-1943, that reputation had reached both sides of the war. To the Allies, the B-17 had become the beating heart of strategic bombing, a flying spear aimed at the Reich's industrial lifelines. To the Germans, it was an enemy that refused to die, a mechanical embodiment of the enemy's stubbornness. But the true test of this aircraft, and of the men who flew it, was only beginning. The raids that would follow would turn the blue skies over Germany into a storm of metal and fire, where thousands would die and legends would be born amid ruin. The Flying Fortress had not been born in a hurry. Its creation stretched back to the late 1930s, long before America entered the war. Boeing's engineers, working in Seattle, had envisioned a heavy bomber that could cross oceans, defend itself, and strike targets with surgical precision. The prototype, the Model 299, first flew in 1935, gleaming in polished aluminum and armed with 5 machine guns. A Seattle reporter, awed by its appearance, called it a flying fortress. The name stuck. In an era when most bombers carried 2 or 3 guns, the idea of a self-defending fortress in the air was radical. The Army Air Corps saw potential and risk. Budgets were tight, doctrine unproven, but Boeing persisted. By 1939, with Europe already ablaze, the US ordered new versions, the B-17B, then C-D, and finally the B-17E, each stronger, faster, and heavier than the last. When war came to America after Pearl Harbor, the B-17 was ready, but untested against a modern enemy. Its first taste of combat came in 1942, when small groups flew from English airfields under the banner of the newly formed 8th Air Force. The strategy was ambitious, daylight precision bombing, a direct challenge to Britain's nighttime area bombing. American commanders believed daylight would allow accuracy. British airmen believed it meant suicide, yet the Americans pressed on. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Vega churned out thousands of fortresses. Each one carried the hopes of engineers who had designed every inch for survival. The self-sealing fuel tanks swelled with rubber after puncture, choking fire before it could spread. Armor plate wrapped the cockpit, engines, and bomb bay. Redundant hydraulic and electrical systems meant even with massive structural damage, control might remain possible. Still, no amount of metal could ease the burden on the men who flew. The inside of a B-17 was a world of freezing air and constant vibration. At altitude, the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. Oxygen masks frosted over, fingers turned numb, and guns jammed from the cold. Each crewman had his own battle station, the pilot and co-pilot wrestling with heavy controls. The bombardier crouched over the Norden bomb site, the navigator tracing paths on maps lit by red lamps. The waist gunners crouched by open windows, eyes fixed on the sky for streaking fighters. They lived in deafening noise, engines roaring, flak bursting, machine guns rattling. Communication was brief and disciplined. Each man depended on the other completely. The bond between a B-17 crew wasn't friendship, it was survival. German intelligence took careful note. Reports circulated through Luftwaffe command. The Americans rely on tight formations. Fighter Gruppen were ordered to exploit that. They developed new tactics. Frontal attacks at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. Head-on passes where the bombers' forward guns had limited range. Cannon shells ripped through cockpits and engines. The first missions to targets like Wilhelmshaven and Bremen saw B-17s falling in flames, black trails across a cold northern sky. But something remarkable kept happening. For every fortress destroyed, others returned with scars that defied belief. Crews told of planes with sections of the fuselage missing, of engines blown away, yet still airborne. One B-17 returned with half its tail shot off. Another landed safely with over 600 holes in its skin. German pilots began to talk about them differently. At first with irritation. Why won't they fall? Then with a kind of grim respect. Each mission seemed to test physics itself. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force was ready to strike deeper into Germany's industrial heart. The targets grew bolder. The Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, Regensburg, Schweinfurt. These were the lifelines of the Reich. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil refineries. To cripple them would mean crippling the German war machine itself. The American command believed the Flying Fortress could get them there. With armor, firepower, and discipline, they would push through to their targets in daylight and return. Proving that precision, not terror, would win the war from the air. The Germans believed otherwise. Their fighters, Flak guns and radar networks were prepared to turn the daylight sky into a killing ground. And so, as summer turned to autumn in 1943, two philosophies, one of faith in machine endurance, the other of human skill and fire, were set to collide high above the clouds. The B-17's reputation for survival was not born from myth. It was engineered into every bolt and beam. Boeing's designers understood one truth of aerial warfare. Altitude and armor were not enough. Redundancy was life. The aircraft's 4 Wright Cyclone engines gave it both lift and resilience. Even if one or two failed, the Fortress could still fly. Fuel tanks were sealed with layers of treated rubber, swelling shut when pierced by bullets. Armor plating encased the cockpit, radio room, and control cables. While the fuselage was divided into compartments, damage to one section rarely meant destruction of the whole. Every gun position was designed for overlapping defense. A Fortress flying in formation created a dome of fire. 12 50 caliber machine guns spitting tracers in every direction. Enemy pilots described the first encounters as flying into a wall of lead. The B-17 wasn't fast enough to outrun a Bf-109, but it could make attacking one costly. Its durability became legend. Engineers often marveled that a bomber weighing over 30 tons could return home missing huge sections of skin or structure. The press photos of shattered but landed Fortresses circulated through Allied newspapers, a symbol of defiance made of steel and rivets. To its creators, it was more than a bomber. It was proof that American industry could build something not just powerful, but almost unkillable. The human angle. Life inside the Fortress for the men inside. The Fortress was both sanctuary and coffin. Missions began before dawn. Briefings, equipment checks, then long taxi lines across the wet English fields. Inside the aircraft, oxygen masks smelled of rubber and oil. The air was freezing, the vibration constant, and every surface rattled like a drum. Each position demanded courage and silence. The pilot's world was one of constant strain. Throttles shaking under his hand, instruments vibrating in their housings. The bombardier lay prone in the transparent nose, his face inches from the sky, controlling the Norden bomb sight that promised precision in a world ruled by chaos. The waist gunners stood exposed at open windows, wind clawing at their suits, eyes scanning for fighters that could appear from any angle. A single pass from an FW-190 could turn their world into shredded metal. And yet, every man trusted the aircraft to hold. They believed in its armor as much as in their crew. Many veterans later said the Fortress felt alive, as if it wanted to bring them home. Crews gave them names: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909, Shoo Shoo Baby. They painted pin-ups, hometown slogans, and fragments of humor across the metal. It was a fragile attempt to humanize something that was built for destruction. Even in fear, there was routine. Cigarettes passed around during climbs, jokes over the intercom before radio silence, and, when flak exploded around them, black clouds bursting at altitude, they focused only on their instruments, their formation, and the sound of engines that meant life. The enemy's perspective, shock and disbelief. German pilots first underestimated the Fortress. When the U.S. 8th Air Force began its bombing campaign, many Luftwaffe aces thought it would be brief. Their tactics, honed on the Eastern Front, had torn apart Soviet formations. They expected the same over France and the Low Countries. The early missions seemed to confirm it: burning wrecks falling from the clouds, crews captured or killed. But as the war pushed into 1943, reports began filtering back to Luftwaffe command that disturbed even veteran pilots. Entire Gruppen would empty their guns into a single B-17, watching it trail smoke and flame. Yet it would not fall. German intelligence units collected wreckage and studied it. They noted the multiple armor layers, the redundancy of systems, and the craftsmanship of American production. A single bullet might hit nothing vital. A shell that crippled another bomber might merely wound a B-17. In after-action reports, frustration turned into reluctant respect. Some Luftwaffe veterans compared the Fortress to a metal beast that refused to die. They began organizing head-on attack runs, the most dangerous possible method. Hoping to smash through the bomber's frontal, fire with sheer aggression. Even so, many returned with aircraft damaged or not at all. Among German civilians and flak crews, the myth of the Flying Fortress grew darker. As waves of them crossed into German airspace, each formation seemed endless, each aircraft a messenger of ruin. They became symbols of an enemy that could not be stopped, a reflection of industrial might far beyond the Reich's reach. For the pilots above and the people below, the B-17 had become something more than a machine. It was a sign that the air war had shifted, that no matter how many fell, more would come, and they would not stop. Behind the courage of crews and the strength of steel stood a handful of determined leaders who believed daylight precision bombing could cripple an empire. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, was among them. Calm, methodical, and convinced that accuracy, not terror, could win wars. He defended daylight bombing, even as British allies warned it would lead only to slaughter. Across the Atlantic, General Henry Hap Arnold shared that conviction. He had overseen the rise of the U.S. Army Air Forces and understood that the B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a statement of American faith in engineering and will. To Arnold, air power was not a supporting arm, but a decisive weapon. If Germany's factories, oil refineries, and rail systems could be shattered from the air, victory could be forced without another trench war. Eaker's leadership in England reflected that strategic dream. Every raid launched from East Anglia was a message to the enemy and to skeptics at home. The air war could be won by precision. He visited crews, stood beside the bombers before takeoff, and reminded them of their purpose. Not revenge, but responsibility. "We're not destroying cities," he said. "We're destroying the means to make war." But vision demanded sacrifice. Under Eaker's command, hundreds of bombers were lost, and thousands of airmen never returned. The philosophy of daylight bombing endured because of leaders willing to bear its cost, and because the flying fortress made their belief barely possible. The tactical angle, formation, fire and survival. The genius of the fortress was not only in its armor, it was in its unity. Alone, a single B-17 was vulnerable. Together, they were a fortress in the sky. American planners developed the combat box, a layered formation where each bomber's guns protected another's blind spots. The geometry of defense, wings overlapping, guns synchronized, created an almost impenetrable wall of firepower. Enemy pilots quickly realized that breaking through such formations required extreme bravery. A head-on attack could succeed, but often meant near-suicidal risk. Those who managed to bring down a bomber often found themselves trapped amid a swarm of machine gun fire from its comrades. The air was an organized chaos, traces arcing in red and white, smoke trails twisting like torn fabric. Radio operators screamed bearings of incoming fighters, gunners fired until barrels glowed, and the sky filled with fragments of aluminum. Tactics evolved with experience. Crews learned to maintain formation even when damaged, never leaving the box. Others found ways to deceive interceptors, altering altitude and course in rhythm. Later missions introduced lead bombers equipped with radar for poor weather, adding precision to endurance. Despite the layers of strategy, survival remained a matter of seconds. A burst of flak could decide everything. A lucky strike on the bomb bay, a fuel tank, or the cockpit. The B-17's strength often turned fatalism into determination. Crews believed if they stayed calm, the fortress would carry them home. Many times it did, but by mid-1943, the losses became unbearable. Deep penetration raids over Germany exposed the limits of formation flying. Without long-range escorts, even the fortress had its breaking point. That breaking point was coming, in the skies over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The moral angle, courage and cost war in the air, was unlike any other form of combat. The men in the B-17s never saw the faces of those they killed. They dropped their bombs from 5 miles above the ground, guided by instruments, believing each explosion below crippled the war machine, not realizing that beneath the smoke were workers, families, and children. For many, that realization came slowly. Bombardiers described a strange silence after the bombs fell. A few seconds before the shockwaves caught up, a moment of clarity that felt like guilt. Some refused to look down. Others told themselves what they had to, that every factory destroyed meant fewer soldiers on the front lines, fewer men dying in mud. On the other side, German civilians called the bombers Terrorflieger, terror flyers. To them, the fortresses were angels of death. Yet even amid hate, some witnessed acts of respect. Downed American airmen were sometimes rescued by villagers who saw them not as monsters, but as frightened boys. Humanity flickered, even in ruin. Among German pilots too, the line blurred. Some Luftwaffe aces admitted later they felt pity for fortress crews. Men trapped in flaming metal, thousands of feet above the earth, fighting not for vengeance, but to survive. The air war was a contest not just of steel and fire, but of conscience. It tested the idea of moral warfare, the belief that destruction could lead to peace. For both sides, the cost was immense. By the summer of 1943, the Flying Fortress stood at the center of that paradox, an icon of heroism and a symbol of devastation. It had proven its worth, but the skies ahead would turn darker still.